In the year 1887, along a winding river hemmed by whispering pines and sloping hills, there sat a town so modest it barely had a name. Locals called it Greywick. The soil there was dark and soft, easy to turn, and in the spring, wild violets overtook the gravestones like the dead had grown flowers from their mouths. When the Wexler family arrived, they came with silk gloves, pressed wool, and a ledger too thick for the number of people they claimed to be. 3 of them, Mother Agnes, Father Elias, and young Clara, who never seemed to age, took residence in a tall gabled house near the edge of the cemetery. It was a respectable home with hedges clipped low and a gate that never rusted. No one saw them arrive with furniture. No one saw them hire help, but within a week their parlor had become the preferred place for mourning. The Wexlers weren't undertakers, at least not by title, but they offered their services freely. When a child drowned in the spring flood, it was Agnes who led the hymns and Elias who arranged a handsome white casket at no cost. When typhoid stole a family of 5, it was Clara who placed a single flower on each pew, her dress uncreased, her hands folded like they had never touched soil. The town breathed easier, comforted by ritual and order. And then something peculiar began. The Wexlers purchased grave plots in bulk, first 10, then 30, then all that remained of the town's future dead. At the registrar's office they paid in full, coin wrapped in clean linen, not a penny missing. The graveyard, once patchy and uneven, was suddenly mapped with geometric precision, rows marked in charcoal, stones set before names were known. They called it preparation. They called it providence, but the ground never broke. Not really. Funerals continued. Coffins were wheeled out of the church and loaded into Wexler wagons. Mourners would weep at the chapel, walk behind the procession until it passed the iron gate, and then be gently turned away. The family prefers a quiet laying to rest, they were told. Just kin and clergy. Sometimes no one was invited at all. Sometimes a death would be announced, and a week later a stone would appear with the name and date. But not always. Sometimes there were no stones, just a space. Just grass. When summer rains came, the field remained flat. No freshly filled mounds, no caved earth from settling wood, no flowers left to wither in the sun. People noticed, but not enough to care. The Wexlers were kind. Their hymns were soft. Their home smelled of cinnamon and old lace. And above all, they made death easy. The town had lived hard. Most had buried kin with their own hands. They dug holes until their palms blistered, watched their dead swallowed by cold dirt, and gone home with the stink of pine resin in their lungs. But the Wexlers? They gave them polished boxes, perfumed air, and silence. No mess, no blood, no weight to carry. So when the ground remained undisturbed, they told themselves it was just a new way, a gentler way. The clerk once asked Elias very politely if the graves had been double dug, perhaps more than one resting together. Elias smiled, patted his ledger, and said, "Every soul receives its measure." When pressed for detail, he added softly, "There is more than one kind of burial." And somehow, that was enough. The local boys who once roamed the cemetery in mischief stopped playing there. Dogs refused to cross the gravel path. One night, a widow returned to leave flowers for her brother, and found her usual path blocked by trimmed hedges that hadn't been there the day before. She blinked, confused, then convinced herself she had remembered wrong. The Wexlers never raised their voices. They never advertised. They only asked for stillness. Over time, the townspeople began to speak more softly when passing the field. The funeral bells rang less often, though the deaths continued. There were no screams, no violence, no signs of sin, only that the ground stayed smooth. only that the dead disappeared without a sound. And through every season, the Wexler house remained, its windows shut, its curtains still, watching, listening, reflecting nothing, not grief, not joy, only the town, mirrored back in quiet compliance. From a distance, the cemetery looked like any other. Until you looked closer, until you realized the grass was unbroken, the stones were few, and the earth never breathed. And as autumn came and the fog thickened, the camera would drift low over that silent field, across the empty rows and polished stones that bore no names, toward the house at the edge of town, the one with too many rooms, the one whose windows never closed, the one that watched every grave it had bought and never used. The ground stays still, but something waits beneath it. And next we find the numbers, the ledgers, that hold more than names. In the back room of the registrar's office, behind a thin door that always swelled in the rain, sat a man who loved numbers more than people. Mr. Harlan, the bookkeeper, had held his post for 23 years and never once lost a cent. He tracked birth certificates, land claims, livestock taxes, and, most notably, the cemetery trust. He called it a sacred duty, this quiet record of the town's comings and goings from the world. Every burial had a line, every line had a number, every number had a ledger. It was late winter when he noticed something strange. Not sudden, not scandalous, just off. The cemetery fund, which he'd expected to draw low after a year of influenza and infant coughs, was untouched. Full, in fact. Full and still swelling. Receipts had been submitted regularly, but none for headstones, none for digging labor, and none for cartage beyond what the Wexlers provided themselves. He flipped through the recent ledgers with fingers that still bore the blue stain of fresh ink. The entries were identical. Care rendered. Stone placed. Prep concluded. Each followed by a sum in neat cursive and a signature in scarlet ink. Always Wexler. Always fulfilled, that word again. Not paid, not complete. Fulfilled. It wasn't the money that disturbed him. It was the absence. The town had lost 27 souls that year. The books reflected only the transaction, never the action. No gravediggers had been paid. No stonecutters invoiced. No clothiers called for burial shrouds. It was as though the Wexlers handled everything privately, invisibly, completely outside the web of community life. And yet the fund grew. Agnes Wexler had donated a substantial sum after each death, calling it a trust renewal. Harlan had dutifully recorded every one. Still, the ledger felt empty despite its numbers. Full of names, but hollow beneath. He asked the town clerk once, quietly over tea, if anyone had audited the graves. The clerk frowned as though the question was uncouth.
"Why would we disturb the resting?"
he asked, tapping a folder with his ring finger. Records are pristine. The Wexlers even file before the funeral ends. That was true. Sometimes the paperwork came first. The date of death, the ledger entry, the Wexler signature, all in place before the widow had folded her veil. It was impossible. It was precise. And no one questioned it. Harlan began noting discrepancies in a private notebook. Nothing dramatic. Just small marks, across here, a double underline there. In time he realized there were no receipts for coffins from any local carpenter. No shipping forms. No contracts for stone shipments. Yet the fields looked full, at least from a distance. Neat rows, measured silence. Too measured. He searched deeper into the Wexler archives, the records going back to their first arrival. The pattern never changed. Each entry was the same rhythm, the same sums, the same word. Fulfilled. and beside it in a faded column marked Disposition were symbols he had never noticed before. A dot with a small arc above it, a crescent bisected by a line, a closed square like a room with no door. They weren't funeral codes. They weren't legal. He couldn't match them to any official record. He traced one particular symbol, a half circle nested within a triangle, across 5 different deaths. All from the same week, all listed as private services held at sunset. He remembered that week. The air had smelled of burning hair. Still no one spoke. The sheriff said nothing. The mayor, when shown a duplicate page, laughed and said the Wexlers had the right of it. Death should be tidy. The town was grateful for their work. Every time the Wexlers handled a burial, fewer people had to mourn. It was easier. Harlan filed the anomalies under clerical oddities. A harmless folder. A limbo for strange facts with no one to confess to. He did not confront them. He did not speak. But one night as he closed the ledger, he noticed the ink was still wet despite hours of drying. The word fulfilled shimmered faintly in candlelight, the scarlet ink bleeding out at the edges. Slowly it spread, blooming like rot beneath varnish until the curve of a crest emerged on the page, the Wexler family's emblem, etched where no ink should remain. It looked like a doorway, not drawn, but opened. As he reached out to blot it, the page pulsed beneath his hand, and something deep within the paper felt warm. Breathing. He shut the ledger. He locked it. He never opened it again. But the mark was set. The ink did not fade. It waited. And as we follow that bleeding page back through time, we are drawn to the source, the Wexlers themselves and the order beneath their kindness. A method of belief, a family not born but built around the quiet dismantling of death itself. Next we meet them. Not in public, not as mourners, but in the privacy of their rules, in the rhythm of their rituals, in the method behind the mercy. 3 generations lived in the Wexler house, though to outsiders it never looked crowded. At the front stood Agnes, the matriarch, her smile lined with the softness of a woman who had delivered 100 pies to grieving neighbors. She hosted hymn circles every Sunday evening, filling the parlor with women in shawls and men with work-worn hands. The hymns were calm. Not the rousing songs of revival, but quiet melodies that smoothed sorrow like iron pressing a sheet. Agnes kept her hands folded as she led the tunes, the way a schoolmistress might fold them while watching children recite. Her presence was reassuring, almost motherly, but there was something fixed in her expression, as though her smile was always in place, even when no one was looking. Her son Elias managed the cemetery trust. He was a tall man with narrow shoulders, known for his careful penmanship and quiet way of listening without blinking. Elias spoke rarely, but when he did, it was always to offer solutions. Families who could not afford plots found one waiting for them, already paid. Coffins arrived without charge. Paperwork never tangled. He treated death as an account to be balanced. Every number matched, every receipt precise. To him, grief was not a wound but a debt, and he prided himself on paying it before anyone asked. Then there was Clara, the daughter, pale and sharp-eyed, who sang to ward off storms. Children said she could calm the river when it rose in spring, her voice spilling from open windows in long, unbroken notes that carried down the valley. She was neither young nor old. Her face never changed, her skin untouched by sun or hardship. Clara was the one people saw last at funerals, standing at the threshold of the chapel, her lips moving in soundless prayer as the coffin was wheeled past. It was said her singing soothed the dead into silence. though no one wanted to admit they believed it. Together, the Wexlers performed grief as a service. They treated it like laundry, sorted, folded, and put away. They would collect sorrow from the doorstep, carry it inside, and return it pressed flat, neat, and manageable. The town came to rely on them. Death no longer disrupted the rhythm of life. No one had to linger with a body in their home. No one had to watch soil pile over someone they loved. Instead, Agnes brought tea, Elias brought receipts, and Clara brought a hymn. Grief was softened, stored, and returned as memory without weight. But the Wexlers went further than comfort. They believed death should never disturb the living, not even in trace, and so they removed signs of it, not only from streets and homes, but from bodies themselves. They treated the dead as objects to be tidied, signs of decay as stains to be erased. To them, the body was not sacred. It was simply matter that threatened disorder. A mark on the table, a wrinkle in cloth, something that could and must be smoothed out. When neighbors spoke of their work, they called it mercy. They said the Wexlers spared families the sight of ugliness. But behind the house, within closed doors, the method was different. Elias had designed tools that erased more than blemishes. He had a press that flattened bruised flesh until it seemed unmarked, a tincture that sealed lips in a perfect smile, a method of draining blood without spilling a drop. Agnes whispered hymns as she applied oils to stiffened joints, forcing limbs into postures of peace. Clara sang notes that held steady as bodies were arranged, her voice shaping the silence that followed. What they did was quiet, almost tender. And wrong. There were no open caskets in Greywick after the Wexlers came. Families no longer touched the skin of their dead. No one laid flowers on a breast or kissed a brow. Everything was handled with care too clean to question. A widow once asked why she could not see her husband before the burial. Elias only lowered his eyes and murmured that the body was already fulfilled. She accepted it, relieved not to face the horror herself. The Wexlers understood something terrible, that people wanted to believe grief could be neat, that sorrow could be folded and put away like linen, and so they provided it, patiently, precisely. They gave the town the illusion it craved, and in return the town gave them silence. At night, when the parlor emptied, Agnes hummed softly to herself as she wiped candle soot from the hymnals. Elias went to his ledgers, balancing names against symbols that no one else understood. Clara stood by the window, gazing out at the cemetery as if listening for voices that only she could hear. In those moments, the Wexler method revealed its true face. Not kindness, not duty, but control. They did not simply handle death. They governed it. And as the final hymn of the evening faded into silence, one soft note hung longer than it should have, trembling in the still air. It did not end when the mouths closed. It lingered, carrying us down through the floorboards, down into the rooms below the parlor where the Wexlers' real work waited, hidden and unfinished. Below the Wexler parlor, beneath the hymn books and doilies and sweet-smelling tea, was a set of narrow rooms no visitor ever saw. They were not basements, not cellars, not dug for storage. They were built with purpose. The stairwell descended not into darkness, but into light that never flickered. Gas lamps were encased in frosted glass, each trimmed in brass, each affixed with silent precision at equidistant intervals. The air was neither musty nor cold. It was managed, regulated. The spaces were cleaner than any room above them, and infinitely more careful. To step into those rooms was to enter a place that looked, at first glance, like a mixture of a church and a classroom. Instruments lined the walls in symmetrical arrays, pipes that resembled organ reeds, belts that looked like book straps, metal rods no thicker than knitting needles. There were panels of brass fitted with dials that glowed faintly, though no source of power could be traced. A row of boxes no larger than a crib, each with a narrow glass slit at eye level, sat beneath a lattice window that faced a brick wall. On the shelves sat coils of fine copper wire, vials filled with translucent oils, and a rack of gloves stitched with silver thread. It was all so polite. So clean, so terribly quiet. The walls themselves were lined in mirrors, but not to reflect. Every mirror was turned backward, face pressed against the plaster. Not covered, not removed, just turned, as if the Wexlers believed even a reflection had no right to witness what happened here, as if seeing it would be a kind of complicity. In these rooms, the Wexlers did not speak of death as an end. They treated it as a process, not a stopping but a repurposing. They did not think of themselves as killers. They never struck in anger. Their methods were not born of hatred but of control, ritualized, structured, and utterly without chaos. To them, pain was not punishment. It was silence made visible. The window box was a favorite of Elias, a tall rectangular chamber, lined with velvet on 3 sides, its ceiling painted like sky. A thin slit revealed real daylight, but no air passed through. The body inside was sealed upright, unmoving, forced to stand with chin raised. The light changed with the hour, but the temperature never did. The person could see clouds drift past, but could not feel the breeze. Over time, the brain lost track of seasons. Some began to count the leaves they never touched. Others prayed to the patch of sky as if it were God's eye watching from above. Eventually, the distinction between ground and sky, breath and absence, became nothing at all. Then there was the still clock, a small machine, no larger than a sewing box, with a single dial and 1 long needle. It was attached to the pulse point at the neck and calibrated to tick with a rhythm not one's own. If the wearer's heart beat too quickly, it slowed the sound. If too slow, it pulsed faster. The device was tuned to a pace of someone long dead. Clara's voice once hinted this, though never aloud. The result was dissonance, a body unable to trust its own cadence. Those subjected to it often began to tremble without knowing why. Breathing mismatched heartbeat. Thought dislocated from time. But the worst was the kind chair. A simple wooden frame, armless, upright, cushioned, pleasant. Its only distinction was its demand for perfect posture. Once seated, small clasps at the waist, ankles, and back would engage, not with force but with suggestion. Enough pressure to straighten the spine, lift the chin, and center the eyes. A perfect pose. The seat adjusted every few hours, shifting minutely to avoid blood clots. There was no injury, no visible damage, just stillness sculpted into agony. Over days the body would rebel, spasms, hallucinations, whispered sobs, and still the chair would hold. None of this was called torture. The Wexlers never used that word. They spoke of quieting, alignment, and fulfillment. Agnes believed disorder of the body led to disorder of the soul. Elias believed grief made people forget their form. Clara believed the dead should not rot, but be made into stillness that resembled peace. Their cruelty was never loud. It was never rage. It was precise. They selected subjects with care. Orphans whose names were never written in ink, drifters whose faces were never painted in memory, women thought to be mad, boys labeled unfit for labor. They did not scream. The walls below were built too thick, the mirrors too firmly turned. The gas lamps burned too steadily for chaos to survive here. The town never asked what was beneath the house, and the Wexlers never invited them to know. And now, in this chamber of symmetry and silence, a gloved hand reaches toward the wall. It finds the last mirror, the one at the farthest edge of the corridor. Slowly it turns it forward, just once, and what it reveals is not a reflection but a face, pale, wide-eyed, waiting. It is time to meet the first case, the first fulfilled, the first person whose name vanished from the records, but whose soul never left the house. The Wexlers understood something most families could never bring themselves to admit, that children who had no one to speak for them could vanish without consequence. It was not the beloved sons of merchants or the daughters of farmers they sought. It was those already invisible, orphans with no papers, travelers left behind by wagons, the sick who coughed in doorways no one wanted to open. These were the ones who entered the Wexler home without resistance, because no one asked after them. If they did, it was only with a passing word soon forgotten. The method was always gentle at first. Agnes would smile, her voice tender as she spoke of care. Clara would hum as if the air itself were soothing. Elias would carry in a box no larger than a loaf of bread, polished wood with brass inlays, its crank wound with slow precision. The music it made was thin, fragile, almost sweet. A child's toy, a comfort. They set it beside the bed of the chosen and let it play, its tiny gears ticking like a second heartbeat in the room. At first it was only background, a tune too faint to notice, but the Wexlers understood patience. The melody never ceased, and over time it became the measure of the child's breathing. Inhalation followed the rise of the note, exhalation the fall. Soon the body obeyed without thought, lungs moving in service to the mechanism. They called this practice borrowed lullaby. Clara was its keeper. She believed that sorrow began with sound, that the first crack of grief was always a cry. Her task was to prevent it. Thin brass reeds were placed near the mouth and nose, tuned to hum softly when breath passed through them. They created a drone, steady and low, guiding chest and throat into rhythm. When a child tried to weep, the reed would overwhelm the cry with its own hum, redirecting breath until it no longer belonged to the child, but to the device. The sob became silence. The voice disappeared beneath the sound. To any listener outside the room, it was not screaming they heard, but singing. It was methodical, not violent. There were no bruises, no marks to shame the family that had lost them. The children simply vanished into quiet. The music box lulled them into stillness. The reeds consumed their voices, and the town, passing by the windows of the Wexler house, heard only harmony. They spoke of the family's gift, how their hymns softened the suffering of the weakest. They did not ask why the weak were never seen again. The victims of borrowed lullaby rarely fought. The Wexlers chose them for that reason. Orphans too starved to resist, travelers too weary to flee, the sick too frail to raise alarm. Those who might have struggled were never taken. Only the voiceless, only those already half ignored became the choir no one questioned. Agnes recorded each in her private ledger, writing the name if known, or a simple description if not. Boy, thin dark hair. Girl, pale red shawl. Every entry ended with the word fulfilled, the same scarlet ink that Elias used for the cemetery fund. To the family, the child's silence was not death but completion. They believed they had purified sorrow by removing its sound, erasing the disruption that grief inflicted on the living. It was never quick. That was part of the cruelty. The music box wound for hours, its gears refusing to falter, its tune repeating endlessly until it embedded itself in thought. Clara would sit in the room, her posture still, her lips pressed together in a faint smile as if she were a guardian angel. She never touched the children. She never scolded them. She simply hummed when the reeds did not, keeping the rhythm intact, never allowing silence to break. Eventually, the body surrendered, breath aligned to the device, heart slowed to the tune. When exhaustion came, the child did not weep. They could not. Their voice no longer belonged to them. They passed quietly, heads tilted, eyes half closed, lulled not by kindness but by domination of rhythm. And when it was over, the room was immaculate. The bedclothes smoothed, the box returned to its shelf, the reeds cleaned until no trace of breath lingered. Agnes would fold a blanket, Elias would file a receipt, Clara would close the window. Outside, the townsfolk swore they heard music. They called it holy, they called it healing. But beneath that harmony lay absence, the cruelest silence of all. The Wexlers carried on without pause. There were always more children who would not be missed, always more voices waiting to be silenced into song. To the town it was charity. To the family it was order. To the children it was an end they never had the chance to cry against. And as one music box wound down, its last note trembling into still air, that thin sound quivered and bent until it became something colder. A draft, sliding through the chapel rafters in winter, turning the warmth of hymn into chill. The melody ended, but the silence lingered, carrying us into the next chamber where even voices of faith would not survive. The chapel at the center of Greywick had always been cold, even in summer. Built from stone quarried upstream and set by hands long buried, it held a chill that never quite left its bones. But in winter it became something else entirely. A chamber of frost and breath where the air thinned and the walls rang like glass. This was where the Wexlers offered their most generous service. They volunteered, as they often did, not for praise but for propriety. Agnes became the choir's patron. Elias took charge of the accounts. Clara, of course, became its voice. She stood at the front of the nave, pale against the dark wood, leading each rehearsal with her hands folded at her waist. She never conducted with arms, never raised her voice. Instead, she hummed the pitch the others were to find, letting her own breath shape the key. That sound, steady, high, and clear, became the choir's anchor. They were told it was to improve unity. In truth, it was to bring them into alignment. The nave was unheated to preserve the acoustics, Agnes claimed. They said the stone held sound better without warmth, that the purity of the note depended on stillness in the air. Bowls of water were placed at each door, not for drinking, to test the cold. If the surface froze, practice ended. It rarely did. The air was just warm enough to fool the skin, but not the lungs. Singers came in cloaked, but within minutes their fingers numbed, their throats tightened. Still they sang, because Clara asked, because the town expected it. At first the Wexlers' ritual seemed harmless. Elias introduced breath measure devices, long glass flasks with curved mouthpieces. Before each hymn, every singer was required to exhale into one. To track stamina, he explained. The breath filled the flask, warming the glass just enough to fog it. After rehearsal, they were collected and sealed. No one thought to question why the breath needed saving. Over time, the flasks changed. The glass thickened. The mouthpieces narrowed. Breath became harder to give. Those who sang began to cough more. Not hard, just small, tight sounds between verses. But Clara never stopped. Her voice never cracked, never slowed. She showed no frost on her lips, no tremble in her hands. The choir tried to keep pace. They sang for hours. But something shifted. Not all at once, but like frost on a pane. Gradual, creeping, unnoticed until too late. The singers began to weaken. Their voices lost color. Their pitch drifted. They missed notes they had once held easily. One by one, they stopped attending. Some from illness, some from fatigue, others simply didn't return. The choir shrank. The pews emptied. The music grew thinner. Still the Wexlers remained. Still they gathered breath. Each flask was labeled and filed in cabinets behind the chapel's altar. Elias called it an archive. Agnes called it a sacred collection. Clara said nothing. But when she passed those shelves, her fingers would hover just above the glass, tracing invisible symbols into the chill. No one ever screamed. There were no injuries, no falls, no fainting. Just slow decline, as though the chapel itself was taking something. Not life, not yet, just vitality. Just voice. One singer, a girl of 16 with a voice like silver, began to lose her memory of the hymns. She said they didn't sound right anymore. She swore she could hear something beneath the harmony, like breathing but not her own. She left the choir. Days later, she left town. No one stopped her. No one followed. The others grew pale. Their fingertips stayed cold, even near hearths. They no longer whistled in the streets. They no longer laughed loudly. The town said it was winter, said it was age, said it was nothing, but Clara still sang. Every note the same, every breath precise. The music never stopped. One evening, when the wind howled too hard to hear the bell, the flasks were found lightly frosted, inside. The breath within had turned to a film on the glass, thin as a whisper, sealed in place. Elias called it settled memory. Agnes called it preserved harmony, and the choir was gone. No disbanding, no farewell, just silence. The doors to the chapel remained open, but no one came. The bowls of water remained always still. When spring arrived, the frost did not melt. Not entirely. The film remained on the inside of those flasks, unmoved by warmth. It was breath stripped of will, voice stored without body, an inventory of the unremembered. The town, as it always did, found reason not to ask. They blamed the season, said the choir would return when summer came. It never did, and still the flasks waited, lined on shelves behind the altar, labeled with names no longer spoken aloud. Some so young they had no surnames, just initials, just sound reduced to catalog. And in the center of the highest shelf sat one flask unmarked, untouched by frost. Clara's. Her breath was not stored. It was always in the room, always at the edge of hearing. And now, as dust gathers on the shelves and sunlight filters through stained glass, we follow a single flask as it turns in the light. The frost inside glints, then fades, and what was once cold becomes dry, crumbling into powder that drifts like pollen into forgotten corners. That dust settles on courthouse shelves, and soon we return to the records, to the ledgers, to the paper meant to protect the living from what cannot be named. Spring came late to Greywick. The thaw trickled in slowly, reluctant to lift the frost from the chapel stones or soften the corners of the Wexler house. But as the snow retreated, the town expected its usual rhythm of audits, tax letters, and record balancing. Just enough bureaucracy to remind people that the world still turned. This year, however, the paper came not in measured piles, but in an unrelenting flood. Forms arrived in crates, receipts bundled in neat ribbons. Hymnal renewals, burial contracts, cemetery plot updates, charitable grant reports, each document sealed, numbered, and signed in a hand so flawless it looked printed, not written. The Wexlers submitted it all without being asked. They filed for permissions no one required. They submitted transcripts of funerals no one attended. They listed donations to foundations that did not exist. They documented hymn licenses with timestamps, temperatures, and ink formulas used for signature. Each page came with a companion page, a duplicate, a ledger copy, and a log of when it was filed. The sheriff's office, the registrar, the chapel, and the town hall were buried under paper. Sheriff Ansel tried to read them all, at first. He sat up late in his office with his boots off, poring over hymn logs that listed voices by pitch and breath count. He reviewed cemetery deeds that described soil depth, soil density, and dew point at time of grave preparation, but never once did a page record a physical burial. Never once did it mention a body. When he asked Elias Wexler about the discrepancy, the man only smiled gently and said, "We believe in honoring the resting with record, not disruption." Ansel, already drowning in forms he couldn't interpret, decided to let it go. There was no crime, only paperwork. The town clerk, who had once taken pride in his role as guardian of civic truth, now found himself reduced to a filing machine. He described the Wexler submissions as preemptive, self-auditing, unimpeachable. Every question he tried to raise was answered before he asked it. The system had been overtaken not by corruption but by sheer volume. The Wexlers had weaponized administration. Their grip was not through fear, but through documentation. But deeper in the house, beyond what the town ever saw, the true register waited. Locked in a drawer with no label, lined in red felt, sat the Wexlers' private book. They called it the Book of Satisfactions, not officially, not aloud, but each of them knew the name. It was Agnes who handled it most. Each evening she would sit at the old table in the east room, light a lamp, and open the book to where the ribbon lay. The pages were not numbered. Each began with a name. If the person had no name, a description took its place. Boy from the western road, girl in yellow shoes, widow from the mill. Beside each name was a date. Beside the date, a word, fulfilled, but it was what came next that chilled even those who wrote it. A symbol, different each time. Sometimes it resembled a doorway, other times a closed eye. A spiral, a box, a line through a star. They were not religious symbols. They followed no scripture. They were not medical, not cultural, not alphabetical. No one knew their source. But to the Wexlers they had meaning. They represented not death but completion. Agnes would dip her pen in scarlet ink and draw each symbol slowly, like a signature of ritual. Elias said they were marks of closure. Clara said they were breath seals. Neither explained further. But each believed the act was essential. No act was complete without the symbol. No symbol was drawn without ceremony. The ink was mixed from a solution that Agnes prepared herself. Ingredients unknown, color unchanging. It glistened wet for hours, even days, and never faded. Each entry in the Book of Satisfactions was written only after silence had been assured. Never before, never after. The moment a name was added, it became a record, unquestionable, timed, signed. To the Wexlers, this was the true burial. The act of archiving, the erasure of possibility. Back in the courthouse, the shelves groaned under the weight of Wexler filings. A junior clerk tried once to organize the cemetery files alphabetically, but found that half the names didn't appear on any town census. When he brought this up, the mayor muttered that people came and went all the time, and that the Wexlers had generously handled the burden of record-keeping. The boy nodded and returned to his desk. The next day he quit. The town, overrun with perfect files, perfect receipts, and perfect absence, surrendered. They accepted that not every grave needed soil, that not every death needed a funeral, that not every life needed remembering so long as it was properly filed. And in the Wexler house, Agnes closed the book of satisfactions and tied its silk ribbon back in place. The lamp beside her flickered slightly, though the glass chimney held firm. She reached into her apron, withdrew a brass key, and locked the drawer with the same motion she used to bless a child's forehead. The last entry that night was for someone with no known name, just a symbol, a small door, and as the ink dried, that door widened, not on the page but beneath it. A seam opened in the floor. A hush fell over the house. The symbol on paper became a real cellar door. Creaking open not with violence but invitation, it led down into the next chamber, where the Wexlers no longer needed to write, where the records had already been kept, in skin, in silence, in rooms that waited for the next fulfillment. The cellar chamber beneath the Wexler house did not resemble the rooms above it. There were no pipes, no brass devices, no ledgers or candles or names. This place was colder, though it did not smell of damp. The air was still, but the silence was not emptiness, it was method. This was the room of quieting. The Wexlers never used terms like torture, not even among themselves. What they did here was gentler, more disciplined. They weren't interested in harm, only in erasure. Quieting was the name they gave to the process of taming the human body without leaving marks. To test how far the soul would follow silence before it forgot it ever had sound. No blades, no rope. Nothing crude or violent. Instead, time, rhythm, repetition, and sensation so subtle that protest had nowhere to land. They studied the spaces between reactions. What happened if one's body was never truly still yet never truly moved? What happened when the air hummed at a frequency the brain could detect but not process? What happened when even one's own breath seemed to follow someone else's pattern? The experiments began with tones. Long, unbroken notes played through concealed harmonics woven into the walls. They were not loud, not unpleasant, but they never stopped. A hum that blended with the breath. A pitch so steady it drained the ear until even silence felt like noise. It exhausted without pain. The body began to flinch at nothing. Sleep came but did not rest. Then came the blankets. Not chains, not straps, just fabric. Weighted. Sewn from tightly woven wool filled with fine sand, warm at first, then burdensome. They called them comfort wraps. Subjects were told to lie beneath them until instructed otherwise. No instruction ever came. The weight was balanced across the shoulders, the hips, the knees, never tight, just constant. After 12 hours, a person could no longer tell if the pressure was from above or rising from within. Some began to hallucinate hands on their back. Others swore they were sinking. None could move easily by the second day. By the third, no one tried. Then the floor, always shifting, always just slightly unsteady. The boards beneath each chamber were mounted on a flexible frame, the kind used in old ships. They creaked imperceptibly with the body's own motion, causing a sway so small it could only be noticed after hours. Balance became impossible, muscles overcompensated. The body fatigued itself even in stillness. There was no pain, no fall, just confusion that refused to end. But the cruelest instrument was the library. It was not a room of books. It was a single chair, bolted in place between two towering shelves filled with tightly packed straw bound in canvas. The material rustled with the smallest breath. It sounded like turning pages. Like a lesson about to begin, the shelves were angled forward slightly, creating the sensation of presence of someone leaning in, watching, waiting to read aloud. The chair itself was soft, unthreatening, and fixed so that the seated could not fully stand but would not cramp. Comfortable but inescapable. No voices were used, no faces shown, just the constant rustle In time, the seated forgot they were waiting. Then they forgot they were sitting. Some whispered responses to questions that had never been asked. Others repeated phrases from school books long forgotten. One began reciting funeral verses between breaths, as though trying to fill the silence before it read itself. But there was no speaker, no text, just noise. The Wexlers documented every reaction. Elias would stand behind a glass panel and take notes with gloved hands. Agnes would time responses with a metronome so old its brass was dull with use. Clara, silent always, would pace the corridor outside with a reed pipe in her hand, playing no tune, just holding it like a conductor who never lifts her baton. Their goal was not to punish, but to perfect. They believed obedience could be drawn out of a person without command, that the soul could be trained to surrender without ever being told it had to, that if the senses were bent just right, the will would fold on its own. None of the subjects cried. Not because they were brave, but because quieting took the sound from them before the tears ever came. When they emerged, if they emerged, they did not speak. Some could not. Others simply refused. A few returned to the town, hollowed out, wandering like strangers in their own bodies. They were called simple, called sick. The town pitied them and moved on. The Wexlers never claimed them, never corrected the story. They only watched, only waited. Each subject was recorded in a hidden ledger marked not with names but with times. How long before hallucination? How long before silence? How long before stillness? And when the experiments were done, the library chair was dusted, the blankets folded, the floor swept clean, the rustle of the straw pressed back into its bindings. But sound does not vanish, it lingers. And now, as the straw's rustling fades, it becomes something else, reeds along a riverbank shivering in wind. Outside, fishermen cast their nets into still water. They pull up nothing, not even bones. And so they talk. Rumors begin again. The river remembers what the town forgets. The Wexlers have never buried bodies, but something is being kept beneath. Something that does not rot, and it's listening. There were things the townspeople of Greywick noticed. Small things. Strange things, but they noticed them quietly, as if not naming them could make them disappear. No stray dogs ever lingered near the Wexler house. Even the hungriest mutts gave the gate a wide berth, tails low, ears back, eyes darting away from windows that never opened. Cats, once bold in the alleys, stopped sunning themselves near the east side of the house altogether. Horses grew restless near the property, and often refused to tether near the chapel if Clara was singing. These were facts. The people observed them, and then they chose other thoughts. There was never chimney smoke even on the coldest nights, when frost curled on windows and children's hands blistered from snowball fights. The Wexler house remained shuttered, breathless. Not dead, just without evidence of life. No firewood stacked near the door, tow steam on the panes, but always the scent of something faintly sweet, as if the hearth had been lit not with flame but memory. Those who passed by said the house smelled of cinnamon and pressed lace. They said it like a compliment, though none could explain what it meant, and there was the cellar. No light ever showed beneath its doors. Yet when you walked past, there was always the sense of a hum, not a sound you could hear, but one your teeth felt, like the space itself had tuned itself to a frequency the body resented. Those who dared step close said the doorknob vibrated faintly, as if it were breathing through metal. But no one knocked. No one asked. Instead, the Wexlers gave. They hosted socials in the warmer months, modest gatherings with sugared tea and fresh biscuits. Agnes stood at the center, telling stories with a voice that made people forget time. Elias would pass out blankets each winter, hand-woven and warm, with initials stitched into the corners, always matching the family that received them. No one knew how he learned the names. Clara donated slates to the schoolhouse etched with verses from forgotten hymns. They were too fine for the children's hands, but none dared scuff them. People noticed these things too, and they smiled. Because it was easier. When a mother came knocking one March evening asking after her sister who had vanished on her journey from Crosswater, it was Agnes who opened the door. She listened with the practiced patience of someone used to grief. She nodded. She made tea. She offered no answers. But when the mother stood to leave, Agnes pressed a folded paper into her hand, a grave deed already prepared. The name line left blank. "In case you need to say goodbye," she whispered. The woman took it like a gift, like something holy. She never found her sister, but she kept the deed, framed it, showed it to neighbors as proof that someone cared. She told herself that the paper meant peace, that whatever had happened was already resolved. She began to sleep better, telling herself the Wexlers had given her closure. And in that moment, the Wexlers learned something vital. Kindness could buy silence. Not temporary silence, not the silence of fear, but a willing, grateful quiet. The kind people wrapped around themselves like a shawl. All it took was a well-folded document, a steady voice, and a home that looked safe from the outside. Soon others came with questions, only to leave with gifts. A grandfather received a hymnal annotated with dates that matched his son's birth. A grieving widow was given a stone angel for her garden, identical to the ones in the Wexler plots. A farmer who lost his wife in childbirth was given a sealed envelope marked her final blessing, though he never opened it. He said he didn't need to. The Wexlers never lied. They simply offered alternatives to asking. And the town took them every time. As the seasons passed, the strange details accumulated like dust in corners. A boy swore he saw someone standing in the Wexler attic, motionless for 3 nights in a row. A seamstress found one of her own monograms stitched into a blanket she had not made. The blacksmith's daughter heard singing through the walls of the chapel long after midnight, when no one was supposed to be there. These things were whispered, laughed off, folded away, because the Wexlers never raised their voices. Because they never denied help. Because when something went missing, they offered comfort faster than anyone could form suspicion. And so the town grew quiet with them. A hush settled over Greywick, not born of terror but of complicity. They had not been tricked. They had been soothed. And in the softness they forgot to see, the mother who searched for her sister pinned the grave deed inside the family Bible, between the testaments. It felt safer there, final. As she closed the book, a pressed flower slipped from its pages and fell to the floor. One her sister had picked years before, brittle and fading. It landed beside her foot unnoticed. The flower's stem pointed toward the eastern edge of town, toward the field of empty plots, where the grass still grew too evenly, where no dirt had ever turned. The rain came in sheets, heavy and slow, the kind that drowned sound before it reached the ground. For 3 days, the river swelled, curling hungrily toward the east side of Greywick, toward the high plain where the Wexlers had mapped their cemetery in perfect rows. The graves were set in soil chosen for its softness, easily shaped, quickly healed, and when the downpour broke the levee, no one feared the dead would rise. They feared only the mess. At dawn on the 4th day, the townspeople climbed the hill expecting ruin. Collapsed plots, waterlogged coffins split open, the pale glimpses of things no one wished to see. Instead, they found order, The water had peeled away the topsoil like old skin, but beneath it the earth lay smooth. Perfect. Not a single mound. No signs of settling. No disturbance, no bone. Just tidy rootwork stretching in shallow spirals unbroken. The people blinked, confused. Then they began to clap. They praised the Wexlers for their foresight, for the unseen drainage systems that must have spared the graves. Elias bowed politely, said nothing, and wiped his boots before re-entering the house. Agnes called it a blessing. Clara remained by the fence, eyes fixed on the horizon, lips unmoving. But someone else noticed more. A boy named Sam, no one's child, raised by the chapel cook, wandered into the field when no one was looking. His small hands dug where others had turned away. Not with tools, not in violence, just curious fingers in soft dirt. He scraped beneath a blank headstone, one of many the Wexlers had set long before names were needed. There, only inches below the surface, he found something strange. A ribbon of grit, fine white, cold to the touch, packed in a narrow, deliberate line exactly where the edge of a coffin would be. It wasn't stone. It wasn't ash. It looked like ground shell or bleached sand from a beach the boy had never seen. He ran his fingers through it, then filled a small jar he kept in his coat for collecting beetles. He didn't tell anyone at first, not until the hum started. That night, as he sat on the chapel steps, the jar resting between his knees, he heard it. Faint, low, like a song held just out of reach. It wasn't in his ears, it was in his chest. The hum pulsed behind his ribs, soft as a heartbeat that wasn't his. When he held the jar close, the sound grew clearer. No melody, just tone. Pure, steady wrong. The next day he showed the sheriff. Ansel turned the jar over in his hand, frowning. He didn't hear the hum or pretended not to. He held it to the light, shook it gently. Soil amendment, he said, shrugging. Wexlers probably packed it in to stabilize the ground. They know their business. The boy said nothing, just watched as the sheriff set the jar on the windowsill and turned away. It stayed there all day, catching sun, casting strange shadows on the floor. No one noticed when the glass began to fog. That night the boy came back for it, slipped into the office, cradled the jar in both hands and carried it back to the hill. He sat by the same grave, the same blank stone. The hum returned, louder now, beneath the earth, beneath his skin. And as he listened, he realized it was not a sound of death. It was a sound of waiting. The town continued to praise the Wexlers. Their names were spoken with gratitude, with reverence. Coffins were never seen, but no one asked why. The field remained undisturbed. Order was preserved. And the boy, quiet, unschooled, ignored, knew something no one else dared say. There was no one buried beneath those stones. There had never been, only the fine white line. Only the hum, only the silence left behind when something once human had been pressed into a shape too clean to recognize. He did not tell the priest. He did not tell the cook. But he kept the jar, he kept it through spring, through summer, and every night it sang, soft, distant, familiar, like a lullaby heard in the womb, long before words, like breath held too long, like someone behind a door that will not open. And as the jar glowed faintly on his windowsill, the tone it emitted drifted down the street, through the grass, past the chapel, and toward the Wexler house. There, inside the parlor, the family sat in silence, and somewhere deeper in the walls, beneath the floorboards, a low note stirred in answer. The Wexler organ, long untouched, hummed a single chord in reply. The resonance matched. The sound stretched inward, downward, until it reached the locked rooms once used for quieting, and the house breathed in. The reckoning would not come with fire. It would come with tone. And now, we follow it. Back through the door. Past the parlor, through the walls that remember, into the house where nothing has been buried, only tuned. They arrived. Just after the harvest, 4 strangers in stiff coats and leather. Shoes too clean for Greywick's muddy lanes. Sent by a cousin twice removed. Stirred by the silence that surrounded a missing letter. They brought with them official stamps and nervous questions. The townspeople, hesitant but polite, said only what they could. That the Wexlers were generous, that no one had cause to complain, and that the graveyard had never been neater. The visitors knocked. The Wexlers opened the door without hesitation. Agnes greeted them with tea already steeped. Elias presented records so organized they needed no explanation. Clara stood by the parlor window, humming something old and unplaceable, her hand still as folded linen. The team asked to see the house. They were shown everything. The parlor sunlit and dustless, the kitchen spotless and scentless, the upstairs rooms with beds made but never creased, even the chapel organ polished though never played in public. They asked about the cellar. Elias smiled, led them down. They found it empty, no machines. No instruments, just narrow rooms now, too narrow. The walls had crept inward, padded thick with felt and layered wood, muffling not only sound but shape. One inspector placed a hand to the paneling and pulled back in surprise. It was warm and it beat faintly, as if something within was listening for him. Another noted the strange acoustics. His own footsteps echoed oddly, repeating too long, like someone mimicked him from deeper below. They filed no complaint. They took no photos. They thanked the family for their hospitality. But the Wexlers knew. They knew the house had changed. It had swallowed the old rooms, absorbed the tools. It needed no more instruments, no more ledgers. It had learned. The parlor breathed now. The corners responded to movement. The beams no longer creaked, they resonated. Every step, every breath, every voice was tuned. The cellar wasn't empty. It was full of memory. As the team left, Agnes kissed their hands like a grandmother would. Elias handed them a hymnal for the road. Clara sang the farewell hymn. It was the same one she had sung for orphans, for wanderers, for those who had been tuned too far to return. The inspectors smiled politely, then walked back to town. They said nothing on the train, not a single word. And behind them the Wexler house stood still, until the door closed, and then the tune, soft and low, began again, spreading not outward, but inward. Through the beams, through the dust, through the walls that were not just wood anymore, but something else, something trained, something fed. The house was not haunted, it was obedient, it did not need screams. It had tone. It did not need violence. It had rhythm. And it had learned to open its mouth. Now it waits. And as the story turns one last time, we move not through doors but through walls. The camera slips into the space behind the felt, where light does not reach. There, among the pressed dust and breath-warmed panels, lies the last book. Not the ledger of finances, not the register of graves, but the true record, the one written not in ink, but in frequency, in names erased from breath, in silence perfected, in fulfillment. The final book was found not by law, nor by fire, nor by chance, but by time. Long after the Wexlers vanished, long after the last hymn fell silent, a child exploring the abandoned house slipped behind a panel where air ran warm and strange. There, beneath the layered felt, was a compartment lined in wax. Inside, one book, untitled, no binding. The pages curled slightly, still warm. There were no full names, just marks. Symbols. The same ones once found beside fulfilled. Drawn with care, not language. A dot within a circle. A door with no knob. A mirror cracked at the edge. Hundreds of them, silent and steady. Each mark carried a resonance. Not sound, not meaning, but intent. What followed was slow. The book passed through hands. Historians, clerics, archivists. No one could agree what it meant. Some called it art, some madness. Others refused to speak of it at all. But then people began to remember. Old men who had forgotten siblings spoke of lullabies they never learned. Women awoke with the taste of chapel dust in their mouths. A girl in Crosswater drew the same symbol over and over in the condensation of her window, though she never knew Greywick. The silence had not ended. It had scattered. Eventually, the state seized the land. The cemetery was left untouched, though no remains were found. A memorial was built, not to the dead, but to those unheard. The plaque read, "Here stood a house that kept no graves. Here lived names written only once. Here ended voices the world did not notice leave." It was not enough, but it was something. Greywick became a cautionary tale in administrative manuals. Laws were passed. Cemetery records must include witnesses. No burial without soil turned. No death without a name. New rules. New ledgers. But the memory lingered in ways rules could not fix, because the lesson was never about bodies. It was about how easily a community accepts comfort over truth. How silence, when dressed in kindness, is the most effective form of control. The Wexlers never threatened, they invited, they erased through elegance, and the people let them. They let them because grief is hard. Because asking costs more than nodding. Because when evil comes with hymns and warmth and order, it doesn't look like a crime, it looks like help. And now, the book is sealed in a climate-controlled vault. Though no one knows why it stays warm, it hums sometimes. Low, long, familiar, like a song you almost remember. Like breath held too long, like the sound a house makes when it opens its mouth. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or did it already?